We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to tonight's class on Buddhist ethics in the modern world. Venerable, if you'd like to start us off.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming back. It's good to see you. Happy to be here again. Let's start, as usual, by taking a moment to put ourselves into the sacred space of a Dharma teaching, a Dharma conversation. So wherever we may be, in our office, our kitchen, our living room, wherever we might be, let's take the time to visualize that we're in, whether a temple or a teaching hall, some appropriate location that isn't the same as our worldly experience. We visualize the space as a way to help our mind, not because there's anything particularly special about these places, but any tools we can use to help our minds focus and sink into the Dharma, we employ them. And so as you acknowledge that you're in a sacred space, you let yourself feel comfortable in your body, relaxed, open. Let's set a strong motivation. Let's recognize that we've come together this evening for the purposes of discussing the Dharma. And we do that not for our own benefit alone, but so that we might improve our lives, increase our wisdom and our compassion, and in so doing, increase our ability to be of service to other beings. So we study, we analyze, we practice, we meditate for the purpose of achieving Buddhahood, not for ourselves alone, but for the benefit and welfare of all sentient beings. And so it's with that as our motivation that we've come together this evening. So just take a moment to really generate that thought to guide our evening's practice and conversation together. And let's quickly, we'll just recite this prayer of refuge and bodhicitta. In the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha, until enlightened I seek refuge, through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all may I become Buddha in the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha. Until enlightened I seek refuge, through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all may I become Buddha in the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha. Until enlightened I seek refuge, through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all may I become Buddha. So welcome back. This is our second in this series of 4 about how to take the essence, practice Buddhist ethics in the world, how to take what we study and live that in our everyday lives. So last week we spoke about karma. This week we're talking about the Bodhisattva Ideal. And in upcoming weeks we'll talk about Buddhist precepts and renunciation, as well as mindfulness and awareness. So as we begin this conversation, this Dharma exploration, excuse me. I have a small puppy who wants to get in on the action. He was asleep until we started our discussion. Apparently we woke him up. Okay. Hold on one second, I apologize. Sorry about that, folks. Nothing like the real world to get in the way of our Dharma practice. Sorry. As we begin, let's again bring to mind that our goal is Buddhahood. We take the long view, a broad awareness. We also adopt the attitude or the recognition that to get to Buddhahood, there are many different practices and things we need to study and learn and implement. So there's not a single practice, but many different parts, so that we have this extensive attitude that recognizes there's a lot of ground to cover between here and Buddhahood. And lastly, we have a gentle or relaxed attitude, one that recognizes that we are human beings suffering in samsara and doing the best we can do, that there'll be obstacles to our practice, and we don't push ourselves too hard, but we have a relaxation in the way we practice. For me, remembering these three attitudes is important because on one hand, it's pushing me closer to Buddhahood. It's recognizing that there is a lot of work to do, so I never become complacent or lazy. But on the other hand, that gentleness, that relaxation is making sure I don't push too hard, you know? And so finding that balance is really important in practicing. When you want to take your practice out of your meditation room, you know, or out of the books you study and put it into every aspect of your life, you have to find that balance. Because if you push too hard, then you're going to burn out quite quickly. But if you're too kind of complacent and lazy and don't always have the big picture in mind and aren't always cognizant of the fact that there are many different things we need to try to implement and learn and study, it becomes easy just to rest on your laurels and not actually make any progress. So keeping those three attitudes in mind, I think, helps propel us forward in a comfortable and relaxed and gentle way. You know, we've followed bad habits or backward habits for so long that we need to actually exert effort to break free of those habits, right? What we're doing when we study the Dharma is learning what it means to create new habits and what those habits should look like. The Bodhisattva Ideal is showing us what an ideal life is like in the world. And so we try to model ourselves after that. But that takes effort because we've been doing it, you know, we've been circling in samsara for so long that we have these entrenched ideas and attitudes that we need to disrupt, you know. So the Dharma is disruptive in that way. It disrupts everything we think we know about reality and shows us that what we're actually doing is chasing suffering but calling it happiness. So we need to be willing to disrupt our lives, disrupt our worldly perceptions, and instead engage in a spiritual practice in life that pervades everything we do. And that is what this series is about, right? It's about how to take our study and incorporate it into our practice. How to take our daily meditation that we do at home when it's quiet and there are no dogs barking to disrupt us, and there's no coworkers or family members getting in the way. How to take that and then incorporate it into everything we do. Because our goal isn't to transform study into practice. Our goal is to realize that practice develops from study and contemplation, and that they're part and parcel of the same whole. So our practice is what we do with every moment of our lives. It's the way we treat others and the way we treat ourselves in every aspect of our lives. And so this isn't something that should start with study and then study goes away and becomes something else. It's not a matter of changing our study or our daily meditation into our everything else. It's a matter of recognizing that everything is connected, right? There's nothing separate. So when we expand our concept of practice and realize that what we mean by practice is living in the world, right? When we do that, then we learn what it means to actually incorporate our understanding and our experience of the Dharma into our everyday life, even when we haven't perfected it, you know? Even when our understanding of the Dharma is very small, very limited. Even when, you know, our meditation or our ability to have any sort of concentration or recognition is very, very limited right now. That's okay. We still practice it, you know? So it isn't that we have to first achieve a perfect understanding before we can implement it. It isn't that we have to be able to meditate for hours on end before we can take that into the time between meditation sessions. we take whatever tools we have now and implement them right now. And create new habits that are in line with the teachings of the Buddha, habits that are in line with leading a meaningful and healthy and happy life. So that is the goal of the Dharma, right? The goal of the Dharma is to live a meaningful and happy life. And our job as people who study the Dharma is to understand what that means and how, by our contemplation, our study, and our practice, our meditation, we can actually live a meaningful and happy life. And not just have the ups and downs of samsara be what dictates our happiness, but have our happiness come from inside, and have our happiness then motivate us to engage in further virtuous actions and benefit all sentient beings as we do so. So that's what it means to practice the Dharma. That's what it means to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha. So last week, we talked about karma, this idea of cause and effect. And that was useful because it gave us two ways of engaging in practice or engaging in our everyday lives. One way was recognizing that whatever experiences we have right now are results of past actions that we created in the past, in previous lives or in this life. And that recognition allows us to experience difficulties and obstacles and joy all in this life without thinking that it came from the outside, without thinking that it is inherently existent, without thinking that we're being punished or blamed or rewarded, but instead recognizing that it is our own actions that brought us to the experiences we have now. And therefore, based on that recognition and the knowledge that we don't want to experience continued difficulty or suffering in the future, it encourages us to practice the 10 virtuous activities and to avoid the 10 non-virtuous activities. So understanding karma in this way helps us realize how we are now, so we don't become as upset when we face difficult obstacles, and it projects how we want to behave in the future to move forward. So what it does is it transforms our inner behavior, right? Not our external behavior. The external behavior follows from the inner behavior, but it's our minds that need transformation. So one of the differences when we're trying to study and apply teachings on karma is that, at least for me, compared to bodhicitta, the Bodhisattva Ideal, is that karma still seems like an analytical subject to study. And sure enough, no doubt, there are many different aspects of bodhicitta that you can study and details. We spend a lot of time studying the minutiae about it in the monastery and worrying about very specific details or explanations or divisions and things like this. So there is a lot you can study. But when you actually get down to it, studying bodhicitta is showing you how to practice bodhicitta. So you don't have to go through that extra step as explicitly as you do in studying a topic like karma. Once you have an understanding of what bodhicitta is and how it develops, then you already have the tools to put it in your life, to practice it. Of course, we still need to always be going through this process of first hearing or studying, learning something new, then contemplating it, becoming familiar with it, making sure we don't have any doubts about it, and then meditating on it, incorporating it into our mind so it becomes indivisible with the way we experience reality. Right? We always have to be going through those steps with every new Dharma topic we explore. So there is some analysis, and that can inform our meditation. But ultimately, when we study bodhicitta, we have a blueprint for how to practice in the world, right away. We don't have to create that blueprint on our own. The study itself of bodhicitta gives us the guide, the guide map. So if we look at our lives and we say the goal of the Buddhist teachings is to find the way to lead a life that is meaningful, at the heart of that is bodhicitta. So what is bodhicitta? Recently, my recent course at Tibetan Buddhist was a 6-week course just on bodhicitta. So obviously today, it's going to be a very brief overview because we're more focused on how we can implement it. So I'm going to kind of give summaries, But of course, if I create doubts or questions, then you can ask them at the end when we have time. And you can always refer to the previous course on bodhicitta that is available on YouTube if you have doubts. So bodhicitta is a type of mind that is focused on achieving perfect complete Buddhahood for the benefit of others, not for the benefit of oneself. So it's not focused on being free from samsara, and it's not focused on having a beneficial future rebirth, and it's especially not focused on finding pleasure or joy or possessions in this life. Right? What it's focused on is achieving perfect, complete Buddhahood, which is not just freedom from samsara, but it's freedom from even the capacity to suffer. It's freedom from even the dualistic appearance that can cause the smallest seed of self-grasping to occur. But it's focusing on that not for ourselves alone, but so that we might benefit others. So it always has these two components. One component that's looking for the perfect bliss of happiness that we will experience, but that is complemented or informed by the fact that we're only doing that so we can help other beings. Because we recognize that at the moment, in our current situation, our ability to help others is limited, both in a worldly sense as well as a spiritual sense. But the closer we move ourselves toward Buddhahood, the more tools we have to help others. So that's the reason we're seeking Buddhahood, because it's the best way to serve others. And what's important about this idea is that bodhicitta isn't passive. Okay, it isn't something that we just think about and then let it sit in the back of our mind. It's something that encourages us to behave in certain ways. It's something that guides what it means to live in the world. It's not just a contemplative exercise. So bodhicitta is active, it's activating. And when I think of bodhicitta and the actual meaning of living a life that is dedicated to and following bodhicitta, I think of bodhicitta as quite radical. I think of it as something that totally disrupts the status quo. Because if we look at what motivates all of our worldly activities, what kind of minds are usually governing the show? What is it that causes us to go to work every day to earn money? What is it that causes us to seek out nice restaurants or pleasurable experiences? And it's almost always going to be the self-cherishing mind. What bodhicitta does is the opposite of that. It says, I'm never focused on myself first. My focus is always on others. So it takes this idea of a self that I have, me, and it takes it out of the equation. It says, more important than the self-cherishing mind is the mind that cherishes others. And so by removing yourself from this outlook and focusing on others, having your kind of focus or your awareness always pointed outwards instead of inward, that's a very radical way to be in the world. Because we're taught that what we have to do is take care of ourselves alone, right? Focus on the number one, make sure that we have happiness, we have what we need, make sure that everything we do is in some way benefiting us. That's what it means to live in the world. That's what we're taught. And that's what we intuit due to our self-grasping and our self-cherishing, right? So what bodhicitta says is that is completely false. That's a total misunderstanding of what it means to lead a radical, meaningful life. And so by totally disrupting that idea and turning it upside down, that's why I think of bodhicitta as radical. I think of those of us that are trying to live the life of a bodhisattva, as being these kind of courageous warriors who are looking at all of the perfections of samsara and looking at all the ways we've lived our life up till now, focusing on me, mine, on my happiness, and instead courageously saying, I'm going to focus instead on others' happiness instead of my own. And find my meaning and my purpose and my drive, my motivation, and my joy in other sentient beings, not in myself. So There are different types of bodhicitta, and for our purposes today, this isn't especially important. We can go over it briefly, just so we make sure we're all on the same page when we talk. You'll often hear about the way to Buddhahood is to practice the 2 bodhicittas. And so when you hear that, what they're talking about is practicing conventional bodhicitta along with ultimate bodhicitta. Ultimate bodhicitta is not actually bodhicitta. Ultimate bodhicitta is the mind that directly realizes emptiness that's in the continuum of a bodhisattva or a Buddha, or an Arya bodhisattva or a Buddha. So that is the wisdom aspect. The ultimate bodhicitta is actually the wisdom aspect. And then conventional bodhicitta is the method aspect. So when we're talking about bodhicitta, at least in this context, we're only referencing conventional bodhicitta, quote unquote. So we need these 2, method and wisdom, to bring us to Buddhahood. And we'll see that as we try to practice bodhicitta, try to practice compassion, try to incorporate it into every moment of our lives, that wisdom is necessary so we can do so in a smart and healthy way. So we need these both aspects. But so that's one division of bodhicitta. And we call that a terminological division insofar as ultimate bodhicitta is not actually bodhicitta. So it has the name, or it's designated by the term of bodhicitta, but it isn't actually bodhicitta. Conventional bodhicitta is actual bodhicitta. And then that itself is divided into the categories of wishing bodhicitta and engaging bodhicitta. And so what that means for the bodhicitta in the continuum of a bodhisattva is slightly different than what it means for us. For a bodhisattva, what it means is wishing bodhicitta is bodhicitta that is not simultaneously manifest with a mind that is engaging in the practice of one of the 6 perfections. So in order for there to be engaged bodhicitta, you have to have a mind practicing one of the 6 perfections manifest in your continuum, along with that bodhicitta manifest and active in your continuum, and not latent. So that's what it means for a bodhisattva, to distinguish between wishing and engaging bodhicitta. But for us, what it means, wishing bodhicitta is exactly what it sounds like. It's the wish or the hope, the aspiration to achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of others. And so when we're sitting on our meditation cushions, when we're going through the steps to develop bodhicitta, when we're contemplating bodhicitta, that is a type of wishing bodhicitta. And then engaged bodhicitta is, again, exactly what it sounds like. It's actually practicing that. It's taking that motivation and allowing it to inform how we are in the world. How to transform our inner actions, which then causes our outer actions to also transform. So putting it into practice is engaged bodhicitta. And now, if we actually look at the definition of bodhicitta, real bodhicitta, when you actually achieve bodhicitta, you become a bodhisattva. You enter into the Mahayana path. And so for most of us, we won't have actual bodhicitta. We'll have something that's like a facsimile or a similitude of bodhicitta. Because actual bodhicitta requires no effort. It's unfabricated. So by the time you actually achieve it, you no longer have to exert effort. It's continuously in your continuum and active. So for us, bodhicitta takes effort, right? And at first, we're only able to develop this wishing bodhicitta, and we do it during our moments of meditation. And then based on that, we're able to develop a type of engaged bodhicitta that we practice in the world, but it still involves very conscious exertion of effort on our part, right? This is sometimes called the bodhicitta that's like the skin or the bark of a sugarcane plant. So if you think of a sugarcane plant, the actual sweetness is in the very center, right, of the sugarcane. The bark doesn't have any sweetness. But if you were to taste the bark, it has some sweet flavor. And that flavor isn't intrinsic to the bark or the skin, but due to its proximity to the sweetness that's in the center, it has the flavor of sugarcane. So our bodhicitta is like that. By having this fabricated bodhicitta that requires effort and skill and practice to maintain, it has the flavor of actual bodhicitta. But we shouldn't let that kind of discourage us, right? Just because actual bodhicitta which we only can achieve once we've actually first achieved a mind of calm abiding, a mind that can rest effortlessly, single-pointedly on any object that it wants, because that's one of the mental bases upon which bodhicitta is developed, even though that may seem like a difficult thing for us to achieve in this life. That shouldn't discourage us, because it's our imperfect practice that causes us to actually realize bodhicitta, right? We need this imperfect practice. We need to be samsaric beings practicing, because there's no other way to develop these qualities or these realizations, these experiences. So don't ever let yourself become discouraged by saying, there's so much I don't know, my practice is so weak, so small, so flawed, so surrounded by samsara. That should never discourage you. Instead, that should motivate you, because it is our imperfect practice that brings about our own perfection. It doesn't come from nowhere. It isn't gifted to us by the Buddhas, right? It requires our action in our imperfect lives right now. So, usually when you study bodhicitta, in all the Lamrim texts and the other things, the most common thing discussed is how to actually develop bodhicitta, right? Because the goal is to develop an actual mind of bodhicitta. But there's a difference between developing bodhicitta and practicing bodhicitta or practicing the Bodhisattva Ideal. So that distinction is something that's worth talking about. If we don't put in the effort to develop bodhicitta, then of course we're not going to be able to practice bodhicitta or the Bodhisattva Ideal, because we won't have any flavor of it. We won't have any idea about it. But just trying to develop it isn't the practice itself. It's part of the practice, and it's an important part of practice. But it's not something that is the full embodiment of what it means to live the life following the Bodhisattva Ideal. So there are two common ways that are discussed to develop bodhicitta, two methods that are taught to us, though there are many, many other ways. These are just the ones that have been codified in the Indian tradition. One of them comes from Asanga, or it was most directly explained by Asanga. We say it comes from Shakyamuni Buddha, and he passed it on to Maitreya, and then from Maitreya I went to Asanga, which is the sevenfold cause and effect method for developing bodhicitta. And then the other way that is most commonly taught is the means of developing bodhicitta through equalizing and exchanging self and others. And this is credited to being first taught by Shantideva, though he himself learned it. Again, it was taught by Shakyamuni Buddha and passed from him to Manjushri, to Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, and then eventually Shantideva. So these two methods are the most common ways in our tradition that we're taught about developing bodhicitta. And it gives us a map for first you practice this in your meditation, and then you build on that to develop this next idea, and then this next idea. And if you keep building these ideas, these meditative focal points, then as you realize them in your mind, then bodhicitta comes as a natural result. So Tsongkhapa, in the 15th century, he combined those two methods very clearly in his Lamrim material, his Stages to the Path of Enlightenment. And he created this 11-point step. These 11-step practice of developing bodhicitta. And so I talked about this at length in this last course on bodhicitta, and it's explained very beautifully in the Lamrim, as well as Pabong Rinpoche's Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand, many other texts as well. So I'll just go over the steps briefly so we know what they are, but I'm not going to go into much detail on all of them, because again, developing bodhicitta isn't the purpose of what we want to do today, what we want to learn today. What we want to learn is how to take the idea of bodhicitta and implement it. But we need to understand how to develop it in order to do that. So we said there are 11 steps in Tsongkhapa's combined method. And Tsongkhapa wasn't the first one to combine the methods from Shantideva and Atisha. If we look at the the Kadampa Geshes that followed Atisha in the 11th and 12th century, You see other geshes doing this as well, other scholars and other practitioners taking bits and pieces of the two methods and combining them. But Tsongkhapa is the one who did it very systematically and in the most kind of expansive way, we can say, or most detailed way. So his 11-point process is first you develop a mind of equanimity. And equanimity is this critical foundation. Because what equanimity is looking at other sentient beings and realizing that we designate other sentient beings as due to the three root poisons in our continuum of anger, attachment, and ignorance. And those three root poisons color the way we experience all sentient beings. So the beings that we experience that are colored by the poison or delusion of attachment are ones that we find favorable, our friends, our family, people we like, people that we enjoy being around, people we might label as friends. That relationship is all pervaded by the mind of attachment, right? One of the three root poisons. And then those people that we experience harm from, that we find difficult, who we might label with the term enemy, though that relationship is one pervaded by anger or hatred. And then lastly, and this qualifies for almost all sentient beings, is those that are pervaded by the poison of ignorance. So beings that we have no real feeling toward one or the other, right? We may have met them in our lives, we may pass them on the street, or we may not know about them at all, but that ignorance pervades most of our relationships. And so developing a mind of equanimity is looking at those three types of relationships and realizing that those ideas of friend, enemy, stranger, those are fabrications from our mind. Those bear no relationship to the actual reality of those other sentient beings. And so therefore, we create an equal basis, realizing that all sentient beings are equally deserving of our practice, of our love, of our compassion. And so we don't treat the enemy any differently than we treat the stranger, or any differently than we treat our friends, our loved ones. So this doesn't mean that we should stop caring about the people we love, but it means that we should look at that level of care and concern and then apply that to all sentient beings equally. They say we should love every sentient being the same way a mother loves her only son, which is an incredibly difficult thing to do, right? But that is what serves as the real basis of bodhicitta. It prevents us from having any sort of partiality and developing a wish for those we like to be free from suffering, but then not caring so much about others, or actively wishing or rejoicing in the suffering of people we don't like, right? So we need this basis of equanimity. It's really critical. The label, designation, the idea of friend, stranger, enemy, those are all fabricated by our mind and superimposed on other sentient beings, but they're not actually describing the nature of those sentient beings. They're describing the nature of our distorted relationship with them based upon the root delusions or the root poisons in our continuum. Equanimity is trying to undermine those root poisons and realize that all sentient beings are equal and they're deserving of love and happiness. All sentient beings are equal and deserving to be free from suffering. Until we truly believe that, it's hard to practice bodhicitta outside of the small circle of people that we already like. And if we're doing that only, then we're not practicing bodhicitta. We're practicing attachment. And we're just labeling it as bodhicitta. So after equanimity, having that as our foundation, the next step is to recognize all sentient beings as our mothers. And this involves recognizing the validity in the teaching of past and future lives, and recognizing that in this life, we may only have one mother, but every sentient being has been our mother in a past life, because we have been taking rebirth in samsara since beginningless time, over and over and over again. And so because of that, every other sentient being at some point has been our mother. And they say of the steps to develop bodhicitta, this is the most difficult. Actually developing a recognition and a confident realization of this fact is very difficult. Even if you have faith in the teachings of cause and effect and of past and future lives, even if you believe in it analytically, actually developing the firm and stable recognition of other sentient beings as your mother is takes a lot of work. To look at other sentient beings around you, whether they be your friends, your family, your pets, your co-workers, your boss, and saying, that is my mother. That, it's a big jump for us. So it's a difficult step. But the reason it's important is because once we're able to see all sentient beings as our mother, the next step is to remember how incredibly kind our mothers have been to us in this life and in past lives. And there are different ways we talk about the kindness of mothers. Even mothers, especially in the West, people have kind of difficulties with their mothers sometimes, and they wonder how effective this type of meditation will be for them. But even for those people who have difficulties or have a strained relationship with their mother, we can still explore what it means to have the kindness of mothers. So we remember how kind all sentient beings have been to us since they are our mothers. And we also remember how kind all sentient beings have been to us in lives when they weren't our mothers, in the ways they gave us opportunities to practice, in the way that they modeled virtuous behavior or created the opportunity for our own virtuous behavior and personal development. So even when they weren't our mothers, sentient beings gave us benefit. So we need to remember how kind they've been to us, both when they were our mothers and when they weren't. And once we develop this recognition of how kind they were, then naturally we develop the urge or the wish to repay that kindness. How can I seek out happiness for myself when my mothers are suffering? My mothers, who have been so infinitely kind to me over and over and over again, are suffering. Yet I'm seeking out my own happiness instead of their happiness. I'm following my self-cherishing mind instead of a mind that cherishes them is more important than myself. So that's the fourth step, developing the wish to repay the infinite kindness of your mothers. And then that's followed by equalizing self and others. So that's the fifth step in Tsongkhapa's combined method. So what it means to equalize self and others is it's not to replace others with yourself. That's not what it means. It means to realize that this duality between self and others, again, is fabricated. It's based upon this idea that we have a truly existent self and doesn't recognize the actual nature of reality. And it creates these unnecessary and entirely fabricated distinction between me and you, between who I am as a person and how all other sentient beings exist in the world. And it denies the interdependence that we live in, right? So equalizing self and others, what it's doing is recognizing that this distinction between me and you, my happiness and your happiness, is one that is fabricated. And as long as I keep following that distinction, that duality, and allow this dualistic appearance to guide my actions, then it's always going to be somewhat misguided, right? It won't be following the clear path because it'll be looking at reality askew and not directly. And once we have done that, the next two steps are these two steps combined are what we call exchanging self and others. And what that means is to exchange our self-cherishing mind and replace it with a mind that cherishes others instead. And in this 11-step process, that's done by two steps. The first step is meditating on the many disadvantages of the self-cherishing mind. And then the next step is meditating on the many advantages of a mind that cherishes others. So we do those two steps together, and that's the exchange of self and others. It's exchanging the self-cherishing mind for a mind that cherishes others. And then directly coming from that is developing love and compassion. So love is the wish for other sentient beings to have happiness and every cause of happiness. And compassion is the wish for sentient beings to be free from suffering and every cause of suffering. And so in this practice, the 11-step practice, we combine love and compassion into the practice of tonglen, of giving and taking, of visualizing taking others' suffering onto ourselves, letting their negative karma or wishing their negative karma to ripen on us, that we take all their suffering away and place it on our own self-cherishing mind. And then we willingly give up all of our own happiness and give that to others. We wish that all of our virtuous karmic imprints might ripen on other sentient beings instead of ourselves. And we engage in this meditative practice. They say conjoin giving and taking upon the breath. So as you breathe out, you give love, wishing for others' happiness, giving away your own happiness. And then as you breathe in, you take their suffering, wishing for them to be free from suffering. So that's the combined practice of love and compassion through the meditation on tonglen. And then the final two steps in Tsongkhapa's 11 points, following compassion, love and compassion, is what's called the, sometimes called the special intention or the special altruistic attitude. And so what this is the recognition that not only do I wish for all sentient beings to be free from suffering and the cause of suffering, right? That's compassion. Not only that, but it's my responsibility to free them from suffering and compassion. That's something I will do. So recognizing it as your own responsibility to free others from suffering, to eliminate or alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings, that's the special altruistic intention. And then the natural result of that is the 11th step, which is bodhicitta itself. The actual mind that is always focused on achieving perfect complete Buddhahood only for the benefit of others. And so compassion and the special intention and bodhicitta are all kind of the same flavor. And in fact, we say compassion is the direct and substantial cause of bodhicitta. They're slightly different though. Compassion is always focused only on others, wishing for others to be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. And bodhicitta is still maintaining that other focus as the priority, but then realizing that the way to help free others from suffering is through my own achieving Buddhahood. So it has these two components of looking at the benefit or the welfare of both self and others, right? The focus is on others' welfare, others' benefit, but it recognizes that the way to achieve that is through personally achieving Buddhahood. So it has these two components, whereas compassion only has the one component, only wishing for others to be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. And that special altruistic intention is like the bridge that connects the two of them. Once you go from the wish to others to be free from suffering, you move to the realization that it's my responsibility. And then, depending on that, you develop the two aspects that says, I will free them by achieving Buddhahood. So these steps, whether you do the 11-step practice or the 7-step practice or the 5 steps from Shantideva or any other means to try to generate bodhicitta, there's a type of meditation practice. So you can go through all these steps in one meditation, spending a little bit of time on each, or you can maybe spend a certain amount of time on just every step and go through them slowly, over the course of a week or a month, and then you repeat them in cycles in that way. But then what we can do, if we want to actually practice bodhicitta, is we can take these steps and bring them into our lives. That's what it means to practice bodhicitta, by using the method for developing bodhicitta as the way to practice it. So the ones that I focus most on, and I find the most useful, are the ideas of equanimity and compassion. Both of these are precursors to bodhicitta. They aren't bodhicitta. But if we live a life that is entirely infused with these ideas, that's what it means to live the life of a bodhisattva. That's what actually develops our own bodhicitta mind. That'll eventually be effortless. So before every action we take, or every interaction with other sentient beings, or personal actions, even if it's just on our own, we have to have the mind that says, am I doing this to eliminate other suffering? Or am I doing this to seek out my own benefit? right? If we ask ourselves that, then that changes how we engage in the world. It can change all of our activities, you know. Even, you know, when I reach for this mug, the action of reaching for a mug, taking a sip of water, what is motivating that action? Is it a mind that says, I want to enjoy the nice taste of water or whatever drink I have in my mug? So it's seeking my own enjoyment. Or maybe it's saying a mind that says, you know, I feel the discomfort of a dry throat, so I want to relieve that discomfort. So I'm seeking my own relief from discomfort only. Or maybe it's a mind that says, you know, I haven't quite got a good answer to the question I was just asked, so I need to buy myself a few seconds to think about it. So I'm going to take a sip from my mug so I can think of a good answer. All of those are only serving my own interest, right? If that's my motivation. But if my motivation is to say, well, I do have a dry throat, and I'm trying to communicate the Dharma, and this disturbance in my throat and from talking is making it harder for me to speak, harder for me to communicate. And therefore, if I want to be of the best benefit to others and communicate clearly and articulately and not be weighed down by my own limitations of my biology, for that reason, I'm going to take a drink. Not because I want to feel pleasure, but because I want to maximize my capacity to help others. And right now, a dry throat might be an obstacle to that ability to help others or to serve others. The action is going to be the exact same, picking up a mug and drinking. But the mind that accompanies that action is radically different. One is focused on others, one is focused on me. And most of the time, we don't think about it, right? We engage in the actions of our life without having this conscious or explicit motivation for why we do it. And since our lives have been pervaded by self-grasping and self-cherishing for so long, and those are the roots of samsara that keep us cycling over and over again, when we don't have an explicit thought, that usually means it's some sort of self-grasping mind or self-cherishing mind that is accompanying our actions. And that's what we want to disrupt. And so, again, for me, equanimity and compassion are the two most actionable of those steps in my everyday life. But all of them you can find moments of practice. If you're spending a lot of time practicing on trying to recognize other sentient beings as your mother, and then you go to work and you have a very difficult encounter with a coworker, you stop and think, this person is my mother. How would I treat my mother right now? And why would I treat this person in any way different than how I treat my mother? Because they are my kind mother. So you can take that part of the meditation, that of the development, and bring it into your life. By meditating, by practicing in your private life, in your meditation sessions, you become familiar with that idea, right? By becoming familiar with the steps of developing bodhicitta, you no longer have to exert as much effort in the rest of your life to realize or follow those ideals. You know, bodhicitta itself is a motivation, right? It's supposed to accompany all of our activities. But the way we practice it is by, especially when it's not effortless, the way we practice it is by looking at all of the precursors to bodhicitta and saying, how can those be what guide my activities, my life? If my goal is always to become a Buddha to benefit others, and I try to keep that as my motivation, then what does it mean to live like a bodhisattva? What does it mean to have complete and impartial compassion toward all sentient beings? When I encounter a difficult situation, I remember this human being or this person is suffering. All sentient beings are the same, that they don't want to suffer and they want to be happy. There's no distinction at all between every single sentient being. And yet, almost all sentient beings are running after suffering, grabbing it with both hands and thinking that it's happiness. So if we can keep that in mind when we experience harm or discomfort at the hands of others, before we react, remember, this person is suffering, but all they want is to be happy. and they don't understand what it means to seek out happiness. That's why they're behaving in this way. That's why they have harmed me in this way, because they want to be happy. And not only that, they deserve to be happy. They deserve to be free from suffering. If you let that mind inform you before you react to others, it'll totally change the way you react to others. And it'll totally change the way you experience others' harm, right? When others harm you and you realize that they're harming you has nothing to do with you, but it has to do with their own suffering and their own ignorance about what it means to suffer and to have happiness, and what it means to pursue actual happiness. And the fact that they're harming you is actually causing them greater harm than it's causing you, because it's creating negative negative karma that's going to then ripen in the future for them as even heavier suffering. When you can realize that, then the automatic instinct is compassion. When others engage in harmful behavior, whether it's directed at you or someone else, the automatic response is compassion. Ningje. Compassion. They're suffering. I wish they weren't suffering. I wish they didn't have any suffering at all. I wish they understood the distinction between suffering and happiness and were actually pursuing happiness. What can I do to facilitate their experience of happiness? Both worldly happiness and spiritual happiness. That's what it means to have compassion guiding every one of your activities. And so for me, this compassion, like I said, is the direct substantial cause of bodhicitta. So bodhicitta is the motivation. And we always need to be honest with ourselves, right? We always need to be checking. Am I actually engaging in behavior that is going to move me along the spiritual path for others' benefit? Is that actually the motivation behind what I'm doing? Even when we sit down at a Dharma talk and we try to set our motivation at the beginning, maybe it's easy to set it for the first few minutes. And as we recite the prayers and we bring to mind these ideas, it's kind of easy to say, yes, that's what I'm here for. But then, even as we sit here as part of a Dharma conversation, we lose that. And we say, well, I just want all these details for myself. I just want all this information because I want to be able to practice. Or because I want others to see what a good practitioner I am, or a good scholar I am. Right? So it's easy to think of the idea of bodhicitta as a motivation, but to actually hold on to it can be difficult, to maintain it. So we need to be honest with ourselves. We need to constantly be analyzing. What is it that's motivating and propelling our behavior and our actions? And once we do that, then we learn what it means to live a life with compassion. And we can't let ourselves have this like a very limited or small idea of compassion, right? That compassion only happens when I see others suffering. When I see people who are hungry and I give them food, that's what it means to be compassionate. That's like such a small, limited idea of compassion. Our capacity for compassion is infinite, right? In the same way there are infinite sentient beings who are experiencing suffering, we have an infinite capacity to develop compassion toward all of them. And so it needs to be infused into every one of our activities. Lama Zopa says, live with compassion. Every activity you do it with compassion. I mean, very famously, I think the FPMT put out a poster, live with compassion, work with compassion, meditate with compassion. When problems come, experience them with compassion. Die with compassion. Enjoy with compassion. Practicing this gives you the best happy life. It fulfills all your wishes and all living beings' wishes for happiness. Right? Compassion isn't limited just to seeing gross external suffering and trying to eliminate it. Compassion is something we need to infuse into every aspect of our life. And that's what it means to become familiar with compassion. That's why we meditate on it, right? Gom, the Tibetan word gom, to become familiar. We stop letting our understanding of compassion be this analytical knowledge, and instead let it be an experiential knowledge that is inseparable from our minds. That's what we need to do. But right now, we're not there. So right now, we have to exert the effort. Right now, when we experience difficulties, we have to say, okay, this person is suffering. I wish they weren't suffering. My goal is for them not to suffer. How do I respond in this situation to follow that goal? Not the goal that says, I want to be right. Not the goal that says, I deserve happiness. You know, there are probably a lot of times in our lives when we know there is a distinction between what we should do and what we want to do, right? Like a good example, a very easy example is, coming up this week is American Thanksgiving, right? And how many times have you been to a holiday like American Thanksgiving, one that is kind of focused on excess and plenty and just eating way too much food? And then the end of the night involves you having to like unbutton your pants and barely move because you're in a food coma, right? That's because at some point, I don't need to keep eating no matter how delicious this is. And it would be better for me if I didn't eat this extra piece of pie. But I'm going to anyway because I want to. I know what I should do for my own body, physical health, and my eventual emotional well-being in the future, because I don't want to suffer from being overstuffed with food. I know that's what I should do. But what I want to do is have one more piece of pumpkin pie, right? So that's a very coarse example, but we see things like that in all of our lives. So if we think of that relating to compassion, relating to wishing for others to be free from suffering, there'll be many occasions when there's this distinction between what we want to do, what our self-grasping mind says is the intuitive and right behavior, and what we know due to our study and our practice is what we should do. The way we should live a virtuous life, as opposed to a life focused on our own self. And so, in our lives, whenever we find that tension between what's the right thing to do and what's the thing we want to do, if we look at that tension, at that divide, we're almost always going to find the self-cherishing mind as being the culprit, right? The self-cherishing mind is going to be what is actually motivating us to follow something other than a virtuous path. Because of that, those moments of tension, when we say, oh, what I really should do, and this person has insulted me, has criticized me, what I really should do is just take a step back, realize their suffering, and graciously thank them for their input and leave the situation. That's what I really should do. What I want to do is strike back because I have the perfect insult that will cut them down to size, and because they're wrong anyway. I'm right. How often do you have that kind of experience? I have it a lot, or I used to. Maybe less now, hopefully. But I have huge ego, right? A lot of pride. Someone insults me, especially when their insult is based not in reality. Oh, my self-cherishing mind gets so upset. You just want to strike back. Everything we study says there's no benefit to striking back. All you're doing is hurting yourself. You're not benefiting them, you're not benefiting yourself. Anger never benefits anyone. Actions that come from anger or self-cherishing never benefit anyone in the long run. We know that, but still, in the moment, our self-cherishing feels so good, right? We're so addicted to the pleasures of samsara that we think that they are actual happiness. Living a life motivated by the Bodhisattva Ideal would look at those moments and want to practice the virtuous path, would recognize that my intuition that's come from living life after life after life that's guided by self-cherishing mind, my intuition is to engage in harmful behavior. But what I want to do is practice the virtuous behavior. What I want to do is live a life motivated by compassion, live a life motivated by the mind that cherishes others as more important than myself. That is where I'll find joy. That is where I'll find fulfillment. And when we're able to look at those moments of tension in our behavior and our wants and our understanding of the Dharma, and then take a step back and actually follow the path of virtue, that's what it means to be practicing bodhicitta. Those are the best opportunities for us to practice. because we need to find all of those rough edges, right? Those rough edges show us our weaknesses. They show us what we need to work on. If we didn't have those moments, we could be convinced that we already had some level of bodhicitta. So if we had that mind, then we wouldn't put effort into continuing to practice. And the same goes for all our types of understanding. The best way to learn a topic is to try to explain it to someone else. The more I started teaching, I first started giving Dharma talks or introductory talks before I moved to Sera, so I wasn't a monk yet. But the very first talk I gave at a Dharma center, or was a series of talks in the Lamrim, I thought I understood the Lamrim well, and then I prepared, an open-ended course in the Lamrim, and I realized there were so many questions I had. And the way that I understood that I even had those doubts was by trying to explain it to others. And then I saw those doubts, and instead of, belittling myself for not having enough information, it encouraged me to continue to study, to continue to practice, to develop a better understanding of the topics. So those areas where we see that we don't have a perfect practice or a perfect understanding, those are gifts, because those are showing us where we need to focus our energy. It's especially true for developing bodhicitta. I'm sure for most of us, we have individuals in our lives or in our spheres of influence or experience that are more difficult to practice with than others. Some that know every single one of our buttons and pushes them every time we see them. No matter how strong of a mind of equanimity or of compassion that we think we've been able to develop, 5 minutes in a room alone with this person, and it all goes out the window. Decades worth of Dharma practice and meditation. Those are the best places to actually practice. Those are the best chances for our minds to transform radically, to become closer to the mind of a bodhisattva, closer to the mind of a Buddha. So we shouldn't ever back away from those difficult experiences, from having pristine and unflinching honesty with ourselves, but instead have the courage to face our own imperfections and let those guide us into what it means to be a better person in the world, what it means to live a life that's meaningful. If you look at the most famous text talking about Bodhisattva Ideal, I'd say, no, I'm not going to say the most famous, but two of the most popular ones, at least in our tradition, are Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara, living the life of Bodhisattva, or the way of life of Bodhisattva, or the way of life of awakening. And another one that I think is very common, at least in our tradition, is Tokme Zampo's, Gyalten Tokme Zampo's, the 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva. And if you look at those texts, they don't just say be compassionate. They don't just say develop a mind working to seek out perfect, complete enlightenment for the benefit of others. That's kind of a given. What they do is show you how you practice the 6 perfections and how you use all of the Mahayana teachings in every aspect of your life. So the practice of the Mahayana teachings is practicing bodhicitta. When we look at the 6 perfections of generosity, ethics, patience, a joyful effort, concentration, wisdom, right? And we look at the different ways that we can employ those activities in our lives, that's practicing the life of a bodhisattva. And if you're living the life of a bodhisattva, it's necessarily informed and motivated by bodhicitta. So what does it mean to take the Bodhisattva ideal? It means to look at these 6 perfected activities and make them the core around which you engage in the world. It's looking at the behavior of bodhisattvas and looking at the way that they take the entire Lamrim stages of meditation, from meditating on perfect human rebirth and death and impermanence, all in karma and the sufferings of the lower realms, suffering in the higher realms, interdependence, the 12 links, all these meditation topics. They practice those, right? They develop an intellectual understanding of all the meditation topics, and then based on their intellectual understanding, they meditate and they become familiar and more familiar until all those Dharma topics are indivisible with their minds. That's what it means to live the life of a Bodhisattva. To incorporate all the teachings of the Buddha into everything you do, because they're all pushing you toward compassion. They're all pushing you toward working for others. So these texts and others, they show what it means to live the life of a Bodhisattva. And that's what should be our model. We do have to be realistic. We do have to recognize that we have limitations. We can't actually live the life that Bodhisattvas live, especially Arya Bodhisattvas right now, because we still have more internal development that has to happen. But we can aspire to that life. So, we should have the type of bodhicitta, the type of mind, the type of generosity that is willing to give even our own life for the benefit of just one sentient being. Right? And we see numerous stories in the past lives of the Buddha when he was a bodhisattva, where he did just that. That needs to be a role model for us. But we don't have the capacity to do that right now. And they say until you actually reach the first bodhisattva ground, you don't have the capacity to give your body in a way that doesn't involve activating some level of attachment. So it's not a practice we can actually do, but it's one we can aspire to. We can have it as our role model while still being realistic, saying, what are my limits? And how can I do my best to parallel the life of a bodhisattva using what I have now? How can my imperfect practice become the cause for my own perfection? That's what I have to work with. Those are the tools that I have. That's the clay I have. This imperfect life, this imperfect mind. How can I use them to become a perfected being? How can I look at the way a bodhisattva practices patience in the face of harm? And how can I let that be the role model for my own activities in the world? So we use our meditation practice to become familiar with the topics, to become familiar with the life of a bodhisattva. And then, when we're in the world, we try to apply those things. This person is suffering. They don't want to suffer. All they want is happiness. How can my actions in this moment work toward their happiness? This person who I may not know, I've never met, is just as dear to me as my mother because they are my mother. There's no distinction between the stranger, the friend, or the enemy. So why am I partial towards one? Why do I not give the same loving care and kindness and attention to all sentient beings? When you can even just focus on those two ideas alone, they are incredible transformative practices moving you closer towards bodhicitta, towards the life of bodhisattva. And one of the things that helps in this practice is reminding ourselves for the benefits of bodhicitta, right? If we actually want to live a life that's meaningful, what is the benefit of doing so? Like, why would we actually do this? And this is useful because it can help encourage and inspire our practice, especially when it feels difficult. So the truth is that when you actually are focused on others, have them as your priority, there's no space in your continuum for jealousy or for pride or for ego, right? If you don't have yourself as the center of the world, but all other sentient beings, then there's no disruption from ego or jealousy. And instead, you create healthy and uplifting relationships with all other sentient beings. Just having this mind of compassion makes every relationship you have that much more positive, virtuous, meaningful, right? And having a mind that's always focused on others as best you can destroys your self-cherishing mind. It destroys all of the eight worldly dharmas, the minds pursuing the eight worldly dharmas, right? So just keeping others, cherishing others as your priority and implementing that through recognizing that they're suffering and working to alleviate their suffering, or at least not working in a way that can cause them more suffering, taking yourself out of the center, it creates space. We talk about the three principal aspects of the path, right? You may have heard this. The first one is renunciation, giving up the pleasures of samsara. And that's often discussed with the idea of emerging out of samsara is what it means to renounce. And then the next one is bodhicitta. And bodhicitta is opening, right? It's opening your awareness to encompass the suffering of all sentient beings. The last of the three principal aspects is wisdom of emptiness, the wisdom of the nature of reality. But so we emerge from samsara through our renunciation, and we open. Bodhicitta causes us to have space, right? It's expansive and lets our mind no longer be constrained by these limited ideas of me and mine, my benefit, my happiness. It destroys those obstacles, right? And lets our mind be so much more expansive. So we can use these benefits to help inspire our practice. But the important part of our practice is that every moment we want to have this Bodhisattva ideal. Every moment we should be asking, how is this moving me closer to Buddhahood? And how am I doing this in such a way that it's not for my own benefit, but for the benefit of others? Am I practicing the six perfections wholeheartedly, or am I feeding my self-cherishing mind? Am I recognizing that these other sentient beings have been incredibly kind to me over and over and over again? They are my dear, precious mothers. And am I treating them that way? Or am I treating them in a way that's based upon my own deluded projections of how they exist in the world? What is guiding my behavior? Is it my self-cherishing? Or is it something else? So to practice bodhicitta, to follow the Bodhisattva ideal in every aspect of our life, we want to allow our lives to become one with the idea of compassion. To not distinguish self from other, and instead recognize that all sentient beings, numberless sentient beings, deserve our love and compassion. They deserve to have every happiness. And therefore, we allow that to be the guiding principle that motivates and compels our actions. I think maybe it's a good time to have some questions, if there are any. Last time I didn't leave quite enough time.
It's
Yeah.
hard for me right now to not feel overwhelmed by what you're saying. And I'll give you a really simple example. I was talking to a couple people in the group and some other people earlier. We were talking about something that I do, and they said, it's really nice that you do. I said, yeah, but I'm there anyway. I might as well do it for everybody else. And it really struck me as you were talking that that's not bodhicitta, that I'm not doing it for everybody else, and I could do it for myself. I'm doing this for myself. And it becomes something where I say, okay, great. All the things you've done, all the meditation you've done, all the learning you've done, all of this, and you've done a lot of things and moved your life in really good ways, but still, I'm doing it for myself. And it's hard to not become overwhelmed by that.
Yeah. There's a story of when Lama Zopa Rinpoche was rebuilding Laudo, the hermitage where his previous reincarnation had lived. And he found the library. And in the library, he found this old Kadampa text called Opening the Eye of True Awareness that was all about the 8 worldly dharmas. And he, instead of supervising all the workers like he was supposed to do, he just kind of studied that text. And he said that he left, he exited the hermitage, or the cave where he was practicing, and he realized that never in his life had he practiced Dharma. All he'd done was follow the self-cherishing mind. His whole life, he said. So it can be overwhelming. But the great thing is that by realizing that, we have a chance to change it. And we can still say, okay, even though up until now, most of my actions have at least been stained by the self-cherishing mind. Maybe not 100%, because I do care about others. When I do this activity and I say I'm here anyway, I can do it for others, that isn't entirely focused on myself, right? There is some motivation to help others, to relieve their suffering, to make their lives easier. So it's not 100% negative, it's a mixture. So we have to hold on to that first off. But then second, we say, well, all of my study, all my practice, it's giving me more tools. I have so many more tools now than I had, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago when I started. So even if my practice hasn't been perfect, it still has brought me some results. And now I can use those results, my knowledge, my understanding, my capacity to focus my mind, whatever they may be. I can use these new tools I have and this understanding of the self-cherishing mind and the way it actually infiltrates so many of my activities. And I can use those tools to help banish it. So I'm at a stronger position than I was before. So it's not like I've wasted my time, and it's not like I've wasted all these activities and this knowledge has been a waste. No, I've been developing skills and tools, and now I have them, and I see the self-cherishing mind for what it is, and because of that, I have the opportunity to strike right at its core. So that's a gift, It's incredible. Most sentient beings don't realize how often we're following the self-cherishing mind. We don't realize that we're running after suffering and labeling it happiness. We don't realize that at all. So even having that recognition, even temporarily for a moment, is a huge type of progress that only comes from our practice. So when you feel that overwhelming sensation, remember, we have to have the three attitudes that says the goal, the long attitude, the big picture is Buddhahood, but the extensive attitude reminds us that it's got a lot of steps, a lot of processes, a lot of things we have to learn, and we need to go about it in a gentle way. We have to have the relaxed attitude that says, I am a human being who is a samsaric being who is suffering and is doing the best I can do. And I've made many mistakes, that's true, in this life and in past lives, and I've followed the self-cherishing mind, and I've hurt myself and others, but I'm doing the best I can do. And because I'm doing the best I can do, because I'm trying to better myself, to live a life that's meaningful, I can rejoice in that small amount of virtue, in that small progress. I can rejoice in the revolution that has come to my mind even by recognizing my own suffering, even by having the faintest wish to benefit others and to destroy my self-cherishing mind. That's a huge revolution, right? It's totally upsetting the way most sentient beings exist in the world. So I can rejoice in that, and then I build on it. So when you feel overwhelmed, recognize that it's only through our imperfect practice that we become perfect Buddhas. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Is it
I'll jump in with a question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Where a comment first. Michael, I'm always reminded of the Venerable Katie's comments that every Vajrasattva practice, which are, you're doing good. You showed up and you're trying. That's what matters.
Mm-hmm.
The question I had was I somehow missed, I think, step number 9 in the step practice. I'm not sure how I did that, but
love and compassion are separate steps. So they're combined as Tonglen, but that's 8 and 9.
Okay, I see.
You got it? So equanimity is number 1. Recognizing all sentient beings as our mother is number 2. Wishing to repay their remembering their kindness is number 3. And in the 11th step, we remember their kindness as our mothers. We also remember how they were kind to us when they weren't our mothers. So we have 2 types of remembering of kindness. That's step 3. Step 4 is then developing the wish to repay their kindness. And step 5 is equalizing self and others, which is to get rid of the dualistic mind. Then step 6 and 7 are exchanging the self-cherishing mind for the mind that cherishes others through first meditating on the disadvantages of self-cherishing, that's 6, and then meditating on or contemplating the advantages of cherishing others, that's 7. Then 8 and 9 are love, is number 8, which is wishing for others to be happy, and 9 is compassion, wishing for them to be free from suffering, but we combine those in the practice of Tonglen, and so they're both done together. And then 10 is the special altruistic intention, and then 11 is the resultant bodhicitta.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You know, I started out by saying bodhicitta is what makes life meaningful. And that sounds like an incredibly pretentious way to think of the teachings, right? Because that suggests that others don't lead meaningful lives. So I don't want to suggest that. But in our practice, if we look at the times and occasions where we found most actual joy and contentment, it almost always comes when we're serving others, even in small ways. And so what it means in this way, when I say lead a meaningful life, what it means is that joy and contentment comes from being a benefit to others. There are definitely ways, I'm not saying if you don't do that, that your life is like worthless or meaningless. That's not the point. So I don't want it to give that misperception. But when others are the center of your attention instead of yourself, then all of your activities become that much more powerful. And I know, at least in my life, I can honestly say that the greatest moments of joy that I've had, right, or of contentment or of happiness, have been from helping others, even in worldly ways. That's when I've been able to feel a sense of accomplishment, not in the things I've done, in the things I've accomplished or the degrees I have or the labels that are given to me by others. None of that does anything for me, right? It doesn't improve my mind in any way. And if I'm not careful, it just feeds my ego and my self-cherishing mind. I rejoice in the accomplishments that I have achieved. I don't deny them, but I recognize them for what they are, which is a tool to become a better person. They're not what define me, right? These labels, these degrees, these accolades, or this criticism for that matter, none of that defines who I am. So I don't deny it, but that's not where I seek out. That's not what makes me feel accomplished as a person. What makes me feel accomplished is when I'm able to do anything that brings others joy. And I know I've had that experience, even if I don't always remember it. I can think back on my happiest or proudest moments, and they aren't my accomplishments that make me proud. It's when I've done something that helped others. That's what feels like the greatest accomplishment in my life. And so when I say to make life meaningful, that's the experience that we want to have fill all of our activities, all of our moments, is that feeling of what I have done today has brought joy, has brought happiness, has relieved the suffering of other sentient beings. That level of accomplishment is what encourages us to keep practicing and what makes our practice, potent or powerful. So that's what we mean by leading a meaningful life. So that's the kind of aspiration. And it takes effort. We constantly have to be looking at our motivation, constantly have to be seeing if it's a self-cherishing mind that is inspiring us to act or something else. And at first, it takes so much effort. The idea of seeing other sentient beings as your mother, the idea of realizing that all they're doing when they harm me is trying to find happiness, but they're doing it the wrong way. When someone insults me, it's because they want to be happy. When they harm me, it's because they want to be happy and they don't want to suffer, and they don't understand that their harmful behavior does not bring about happiness. Having that recognition in the moment of experiencing others' harm, it takes effort, it takes practice. It takes becoming familiar with these ideas in your meditation practice so they become second nature to you, right? So none of this is saying it's easy. None of this is saying that the life of a bodhisattva is something we can just flip on like a switch. But that's why we call it practice. We call it practice because it's something that we are constantly developing. We're constantly perfecting, making better, making stronger, right? So that's the idea of practice. Buddhas don't have to practice, quote unquote, because they're already perfected beings. Everything they do is a perfected action. It's free of all partiality. Bodhisattvas take much less effort to practice because their bodhicitta is unfabricated. They still have to put in effort, but it's not the same type of effort we have to put in. But as ordinary sentient beings who haven't actually developed the mind of bodhicitta yet, it takes effort. And it takes a lot of work to rewire those neural pathways from all the bad habits we've accumulated in this life alone, never mind past lives, right? But by working on the developing of bodhicitta, we can do that. And it affects all aspects of our lives. Our ability to engage in study and analysis and in meditation all become deeper due to our bodhicitta practice, due to our developing compassion. Our intellectual understanding of a topic isn't just dependent upon our ability to study it, but if we have a mind of compassion, it allows our wisdom to expand, because our wisdom and our compassion feed each other and they work together. They're not isolated. So bodhicitta, compassion, these aren't isolated experiences. They aren't something we practice and then turn off when it's time to study or when it's time to do something else. What they do is they pervade all of our experiences and make everything we do more powerful. So even if all you're doing is taking a new Dharma text and studying it, and then maybe taking notes on a few key concepts and then trying to meditate on them, if you've developed the practice of compassion, that becomes easier. It becomes more powerful. You have fewer obstacles. So compassion and bodhicitta, the Bodhisattva Ideal, isn't this isolated practice. It's something that pervades everything we do, and it complements every other practice we do. So we don't think of it as being on its own in a silo. Now I'm going to practice compassion. Okay, now I'm going to practice wisdom. Okay, now I'm going to practice mindfulness. Right? No. All of these build each other. The story of Asanga is a great example of that, right? Asanga, when he was meditating on Maitreya, he went to a cave to do a meditation to try to have a realization of Maitreya, the Buddha of love. And he meditated for 4 years, and he didn't have a single meditative realization or experience of Maitreya. And he got very frustrated, right? So he left his cave. But then as he was walking back into town, he saw there all these different examples of him seeing these incredible things, such as a man taking a silk scarf and rubbing it on a piece of stone. And when he asked what he was doing, he said, "Oh, I'm making a needle. I'm using this scarf to shape the stone into a needle." And so he was motivated to go exert more effort. Or when he saw a hole in the rock cliff, and he realized it was because a small bird had kept flying in and out of a crack, and the brush of the feathers of its wings over time caused this hole to erode in the rock and inspired him to engage in more practice. So over and over again, he had these experiences until he finally practiced for 12 years. Still, after 12 years, he had no realizations of Maitreya, right? So he finally left, and he went into town. And while he was in town, he saw this old dog suffering, unable to walk, giant open wounds, and an open wound on its leg that was covered in maggots. And he felt great compassion for this dog. And he wanted to relieve this dog's suffering. And so he knew he had to get these maggots off the dog to help it. But then he realized, and again, this is the step that I have a little bit of a hard time grasping intellectually, but he decided that to remove those maggots using his fingers, he would cause them too much harm. So he first cut off a piece of his flesh so the maggots would have something to eat, and he decided that he'd use his tongue to remove the maggots from the dog. And so he bent down to take these maggots in his mouth one at a time, and he couldn't find anything, and he opened his eyes, and Maitreya was standing there in front of him. He was exasperated. He said, I've been meditating for 12 years to try to have a realization of you, and you haven't been there. How come you show up now after 12 years? And Maitreya said, no, I've been there the whole time. But until you developed enough compassion, you didn't have the capacity to experience my presence. It has nothing to do with me, it had to do with you. But here, you saw the suffering dog, and you developed such great compassion for that suffering dog, it removed your obstacles to having this meditative realization or experience. So it was a lack of compassion that was impeding his ability to have deeper meditative experiences, even though he wasn't meditating on compassion, right? But it was a lack of compassion that was the obstacle. So when he developed this great compassion, that got rid of the obstacle, and he was able to have this meditative realization of Maitreya. So compassion doesn't just inform one aspect of our lives, it informs all of our aspects of our lives and our practice. And so that, I think, is a good place to stop. Didn't seem like I have a lot of questions, so maybe we'll end there, and we'll just conclude with a dedication of merit. So we can recognize that we have engaged in this Dharma discussion today, hopefully a practice that was virtuous in the beginning through our setting of motivation, virtuous in the middle through engaging in Dharma discussion and conversation and exploration. And we want to make our practice virtuous in the end by dedicating the merit. So any merit we've accumulated today, instead of keeping that for ourselves alone, We dedicate it to all sentient beings, that all sentient beings might experience the perfect and complete bliss of Buddhahood and be free from all suffering. For those who have died, may they be quickly reborn in a Buddhist Pure Land, or as a human being with all of the freedoms and endowments, may they quickly meet a perfect Mahayana Guru and engage in the path of the Buddha. And may every sentient being experience complete freedom from suffering due to these merits that I've accumulated today. Through this virtue may I swiftly, having gained Guru Buddha state, place each and every sentient being without exception in that state. Precious Supreme Bodhi mind, may it where unborn arise, and where born never decline, but increase forevermore. Thank you all so much for being here with me this evening. I appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening. And I look forward to seeing many of you next week when we're going to continue our conversation looking at different Buddhist ethical precepts as well as renunciation and how we can practice those in our everyday life. So I look forward to seeing you then.